Hello class, this is Chapter 1, the Correctional System. The learning objectives we're going to cover in this class are as follows. First, we will identify the ideas found within Enlightenment thinking and how they influenced corrections. Next, we will define the early prison reformers and what they contributed. Next, we will articulate how the Pennsylvania and Auburn models differ from one another. We will explain how reformatories contributed to the rehabilitation model and discuss the purpose of corrections. We will also summarize the reasons why we punish, discuss the theories of punishment. We will explain the relationship between corrections and the criminal justice system, describe the extent and consequences of prison overcrowding. We will discuss the financial costs of corrections and explain the importance of professionalism in corrections. We're going to talk about the development of formal corrections and the history of corrections. The development of formal corrections involves the first formal legal code establishing crimes and punishments and was the Code of Hammurabi in 1780 BC. It harkens back to lex talionis, which is Latin for an eye for an eye. As far as punishment during the Middle Ages, it included torture, servitude, banishment, and executions, which were widely used. The first correctional institutions were developed as monastic confinement, bridewells, and houses of corrections. Continuing with the development of formal corrections, there was Charles-Louis de Secondat Baron de Montesquieu, who lived from 1689 to 1755. He was an early founder of the classical school of criminology who advocated moderation in punishment. Then there was Cesare Bonassana Beccaria, who lived from 1738 to 1794. He was an early criminologist who advocated that punishment should be public, immediate, and necessary. And then there was Jeremy Bentham, who lived from 1748 to 1832. He was an early criminologist who believed that the law should accomplish the utilitarian purpose of the protection of society. The late 19th century saw the development of positivism. This was a philosophical system that holds that assumptions about the natural world must be able to be proven scientifically, logically, or mathematically. In other words, the social world operates according to laws like the physical world, which was adopted to help explain the cause of crime in society. Now let's talk about early prison reform. Early prisons were harsh environments for convicted felons. There was no hope for pardon, and felons faced extreme, demeaning conditions of confinement. These included isolation, physical punishment, mental breakdowns, self-mutilations, and suicide. The 18th century marked the reform of the early prison system and was initiated by several influential contributors. Some of these leaders of the early prison reform system included John Howard, who lived from 1726 to 1790. He was an English sheriff who is noted as the first prison reformer. He advocated for more humane and sanitary conditions in jails and prisons throughout England. Then you had Alexander Maconochie, who lived from 1786 to 1860. He served as the director of the prison colony in Australia and set up the quote-unquote mark system. This was a system by which brutal treatment was discouraged and convicts were awarded quote-unquote marks to encourage effort and thrift. Sentences were in stages and degrading treatment was reduced. Now let's talk about the Pennsylvania versus Auburn penitentiaries. Pennsylvania prison reformers are noted as the first major innovators of penal reform and constructing penitentiaries. A penitentiary is a prison in which persons found guilty of a felony are isolated from normal society. The Eastern State Penitentiary was a fortress-like prison in Philadelphia consisting of 7 wings that became a model for prisoners in several European countries. And the Pennsylvania model was a penal system based on the belief that most prisoners would benefit from the experience of incarceration. Now, as far as the origins of American corrections, you first saw the penitentiary, as far as the Pennsylvania system is concerned, involving the Quakers and criminal law. And then in Philadelphia, you specifically saw the advent of the creation of the Walnut Street Jail. And then the Pennsylvania Prison Society, which involved sweeping reforms. This is an early picture of the Pennsylvania Penitentiary, which you can see was that 7-block cell system that I mentioned in a previous slide. And the Pennsylvania Penitentiary system was modeled on the principle that solitary confinement fosters penitence and encourages reformation. The idea was advocated by the Philadelphia Society for Alleviating the Miseries of Public Prisons, whose most active members were Quakers. The Auburn Penitentiary system was named after the city of Auburn in New York, and it was a western New York town that constructed a prison in 1816, which was known for its maximum security and very harsh treatment of convicted felons. Auburn prison officials were committed to the idea of extreme solitude as being essential to maintaining discipline, as exemplified by the quote-unquote Auburn cell block, in which inmates were made to endure great suffering. They were confined to extremely tiny cell blocks, and there were rules involving no talking, no work, no communication between one prisoner to another, and any violation of such was brought about with harsh retribution. Now let's talk about early prison reform. Walter Crofton, who lived from 1815 to 1897, was a prison reformer who developed the Irish mark system, which eventually spread to the United States and influenced the development of parole, which is also known as early release, or at the time was known as a ticket of leave program, in which prisoners, instead of facing consistent harsh discipline, were allowed, based on their sentence, to qualify for early release or a parole program where they were monitored outside of prison walls. Now let's talk about reformatories and the rehabilitation model. The first was the Reformatory Model at Elmira, who was championed by Zebulon Brockway, and Elmira was a facility in upstate New York. Prison operations that focus on rehabilitation through many processes, such as indeterminate sentencing, the payment of inmates for work, the supervision of inmates in the community, a system of behavior modification, and the development of parole, were all things that Zebulon Brockway brought into being. Now, out of the rehabilitation model movement came the quote-unquote medical model. This was championed by Howard Gill. And this advocated the idea that criminality is a sickness that can be cured through psychological intervention. Now let's talk about corrections in the 20th century. There has been an explosion of prison violence that has occurred in the 20th century and resulted in prisoners' rights. And this also brought about the rise of modern management and increased use of technology, which includes turning to privatization. And let's talk about the purpose of corrections and why do we punish. Punishing law violators provides beneficial consequences. Punishment is deserved. Punishment helps to express public outrage, especially considering the severity of given crimes. Punishment teaches a lesson, and punishment helps maintain the government, the social structure, and society at large. Now let's talk about the goals and philosophy of punishment. First is the idea of general deterrence, which is the idea of punishing one person, which will hopefully discourage others from committing similar acts. Then there is specific deterrence, wherein the idea that individual offenders will decide against committing future crimes once they experience the pain of punishment. And then there's incapacitation. Sometimes that's selective incapacitation, where people are put into solitary confinement, for instance. Let's talk a little more about selective incapacitation. The idea is that individual offenders will decide against committing future crimes once they experience the pain of punishment, as I mentioned before. And as far as incapacitation and selective incapacitation, this involves identifying high-rate offenders and providing for their long-term incarceration. Rehabilitation is providing the offender with services and programs that assist in changing character, attitudes, or behaviors that contribute to criminal propensities. And then evidence-based programs involve analysis of programs to discover what works with various offenders. Restorative justice involves making amends to the victim or society for the harm resulting from a criminal offense. For example, arson. If someone deliberately sets fire to a building, then obviously they should expect to make amends to the victim, and sometimes that incidents involving arson, just as one example, can end up causing much more damage than just the building that was intentionally set on fire, but can result in a wildfire where many homes are lost. So restorative justice involves making amends to the victim or society at large for the harm resulting from a specific criminal offense. Restitution means that offenders are expected to repay society and victims for losses, expenses, and damages that result from their crime. Now, the correctional system was designed specifically to confine offenders, help manage these offenders, and hopefully rehabilitate offenders. Convicted offenders are within a safe, secure, and humane environment. However, over 7 million people in the United States are under some form of correctional control, and 2.2 million are currently incarcerated. So out of the 7 million people under correctional control, that means that they aren't necessarily serving an active prison time, but are out on electronic monitoring or some form of parole. But 2.2 million are currently incarcerated. And another important fact to remember, and we've mentioned this before, is that the United States has 5% of the world's population. However, it has roughly 25% of all of the world's prisoners. As far as corrections are concerned, the institutions and methods that society uses are to correct, control, and change behavior, ultimately. The purpose of corrections is to help protect communities. But hand in hand with that comes the public perception of the reduction of the fear of crime itself. Today's tough on crime approach reflects a high level of societal fear. Another purpose of corrections is to help stop offenders from offending, and there are many aspects involved with that. Counseling, GED equivalency, people can even earn college degrees while in prison. All of these things are designed to help stop offending. And the other purpose of corrections is to provide a venue for treatment and rehabilitation, such as I mentioned in terms of GED and obtaining a degree, etc. Now, the correctional system is part of a larger criminal justice system. This includes custody confinement at the federal, state, or county level. It takes place within a larger social context which influences human behavior and reactions. And it involves many participants. You have the victim, the offender, reformers, and system employees. As far as reformers and system employees are concerned, these are people that are involved in hopefully being able to reform a habitual offender, and then system employees who are also involved in that process and help manage offenders in the correctional system itself. As far as corrections as a system, there's a system overload that is a major challenge. Courts are overloaded and overburdened, and as a result, there is an impact of overly large caseloads. There's also the impact of facility or program crowding. In other words, you have far too many people in a space designed for far fewer people. And this can have a negative impact on the mental state of prisoners. This perpetual confinement in an overcrowded facility causes a lot of conflict and a lot of mental strain. Then there's the business of corrections. There's a shift from NIMBY to welcome mats, which is basically the prison industrial complex. You see this advent in the United States of moving from publicly held prisons or publicly funded prisons to a prison industrial complex, which is the advent of privately run facilities. Now let's talk about the criminal justice system and corrections. The criminal justice system is the only body with the power to try and punish offenders. This involves law enforcement, which apprehends offenders, courts, which adjudicate and sanction offenders. In other words, they try and then sentence offenders. And then you have correction systems, which monitor and confine. So they're either monitored on some type of release program, be it electronic monitoring or parole, and then also confinement, especially for repeat offenders. The formal criminal justice process takes an offender through decision points all the way from arrest through hopeful eventual reentry into society. And that it's hopeful in the sense that they're able to reenter society safely and without a threat to society. There are key decisions made by the courts to retain a prisoner or to discharge them. There are also relatively few cases that are processed through the entire formal system. A big reason for that is because the system is overburdened and overcrowded, so judges see fit to reduce mandatory sentencing, which is a whole process in and of itself, and can be fought on the state level as well, all the way up to the formal federal level. And then there are also instances where there are many that are released before trial for procedural error or evidence problems. In other words, if a case goes to court and discovery was made incorrectly, or things were not revealed to a public defender that was withheld by the prosecutor, that can cause procedural errors and cause people to be released. Continuing with the criminal justice system and corrections, the cost to local, state, and federal governments is about $230 billion per year across the United States. It employs more than 2 million people and contains nearly 18,000 law enforcement agencies. That's a huge number. It also contains more than 17,000 courts, ranging from municipal court all the way up to the Supreme Court. It also contains more than 1,200 jails and prisons, and contains more than 3,500 probation and parole agencies themselves. As far as social, political, and legal influences, sometimes you find societal retribution towards criminals, and also retribution in a prison itself. You find retribution towards criminals. For instance, you hear things like child sex offenders being killed in prison, because even in prison there's a code of ethics, and one of those ethics is you don't harm children. So unfortunately you hear about instances where there are retribution towards criminals by other criminals. There's also prison overcrowding, and there are several consequences of prison overcrowding, which we've mentioned. And then there's a question to be considered and is being hotly debated in society right now as of 2020, which is how can overcrowding be explained, and then how can it be handled as a result. Then there is the fear of future trends of prison crowding. In other words, if the problem is bad now, how is it going to look 20 years from now? And then, of course, the cost of corrections. As we continue to incarcerate more and more people, the cost is going to continue to go up. As far as the social cost of corrections, there's also the impact on urban neighborhoods in the United States. There is an effect on the families of prisoners wherein approximately 1.5 million children have at least one parent incarcerated. That's a huge number of children and causes very negative impacts in their lives. And there's a larger societal issue where you have a large number of African Americans and other minorities that are imprisoned, and the impact is obviously quite negative. As far as the financial cost of corrections, many things lead to it, including a depressed economy, depleted budgets, and lack of financial resources that has resulted in the closing of many prisons across the country. Now, a result of that is the growth of the private prison industry, which is a separate controversy in and of itself. Now, there are other countries such as Canada, the United Kingdom, and Australia who are realizing similar trends and are taking steps to try to handle these problems themselves as well. Here is a chart which shows the financial cost of corrections, and you see the cost it goes upwards between police, corrections, and judicial cost. It all trends upwards, and you see a marked increase between 1985 and 2015. So over the last 30 years, you see a dramatic increase in the financial cost of corrections. Now let's talk about the corrections professional. The reality of corrections and the challenge of professionalism means that there is an opportunity to make a positive difference in people's lives and in correctional institutions. There are good pay and benefits for corrections professionals. It also involves state training academies as well as accreditation. Now here's a discussion question for you to consider. How did the innovations of prison reform during the Enlightenment differ from previous systems, which are those in ancient and medieval societies? Do you think these changes were improvements to previous methods, and why or why not? And another discussion question for you to consider. You need to discuss either in a study group or consider on your own the crime and subsequent punishment of Dylann Roof. If you don't know who Dylann Roof is, then you need to look him up, but this was in recent years. Do you feel that his punishment was adequate given the heinous nature of the crime that he committed? And here is a third discussion question for you to consider. Discuss amongst a study group or consider on your own the causes and effects in prison overcrowding and its impact on today's correction systems. Come up with your own proposition for a strategy to help remedy this problem. Class, as always, thank you for your time and attention. Remember, this is to be a tool to assist you with your text. And again, there are particular cases and history that you need to not only read in your textbook, but also research on your own. And again, as always, if you have any concerns or you need any clarification, or if you have any questions, please feel free to contact your instructor. Thank you again so much for your time, and we'll see you next class.